Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Duke Football Coverage Podcast brought to you by Bull City Coordinators. Follow us on our website, bullcitycoordinators.com. You can check us out on Twitter at DukeFB Coverage. I'm at some other social media sites, but who cares? Send us an email if you want to get in touch, bullcitycoordinators@gmail.com. Our DMs on Twitter are open. And we're going to be going ad-free soon, so I encourage everybody, since apparently under the new Anchor podcast distribution rules, I do not qualify for any more ad revenue. That penny a listen does not go as far as it used to. Just go to Anchor every day, mute your tab, hit play until the ad revenue stops. So just get me as many pennies as possible. That's what I've been doing, and I encourage you all to do it. But enough with that. Our next guest played on the defensive line at Duke from 1995 to 1999. After his redshirt season, he moved from end to tackle. He terrorized offensive linemen in Durham and in the ACC until he was drafted in the 6th round of the 2000 NFL Draft by the Pittsburgh Steelers. Shout out Lee Rodeo. And in looking at who else got drafted by the Steelers that year, he is included in a group of Plaxico Burress and Clark Hagens, among others. He played for the Steelers and the Jaguars before moving on to his current career, which we will discuss shortly. And unless something has changed or I did my research wrong, he is 3rd all-time in sacks, career sacks with 20, and recorded 8 in 1996, which is still tied for the 6th most in a single season. He wore number 93 and is from Roanoke, Virginia. Chris Combs, how are you doing, sir?
Doing great, Ben. Thanks so much for having me on this evening.
Oh, I'm excited. I'm looking forward to it. We'll obviously get to the Roanoke connection in a little bit since that's where I am now. But why don't you bring us up to speed on what you've been doing since your football career ended? I like to give everybody who comes on a chance to introduce themselves kind of now that they've got the pads off and the helmet off.
Sure. Well, my NFL playing career ended in 2003, 2004, kind of that time frame. That was my last year with the Jaguars. And, it was a period where I was still interested in staying in the game. And at that time, there was a vacancy on Duke's staff in the strength and conditioning department. And Ted Roof had just become the head football coach. And I was back in Durham rehabilitating a knee injury that had ended my career with Jacksonville. I had hopes of going back to training camp again, but I just never was able to run again. And so at that time, Coach Roof sort of approached me about filling that vacancy in the strength and conditioning department, and that was something that I had been interested in doing. Strength and conditioning had such a positive impact on me as a player. And so I felt like I had something to contribute there. And so I accepted that job. And so for 4 years, I worked with Duke's football team and I worked with Duke's lacrosse team. That was an interesting time to be working with Duke lacrosse for those of you who followed the Duke lacrosse trial there. And I worked with Duke baseball. And so it was rewarding to be back at a school that I loved and being around players that, were just like one chapter behind me. They weren't guys that I had played with on the football team or anything like that. They were just a little bit younger than me. And so it was interesting to be kind of leading them during that time. That was a change for me, but, I enjoyed that. And then ultimately, though, I sort of decided that I didn't want to stay in coaching long-term. And, I really wasn't willing to move around and kind of make lateral moves or even kind of step down to eventually advance my career in coaching. I just wasn't really willing to make that sacrifice. And so it was clear to me that I needed to make a career change. And that was around the time that Coach Cutcliffe became the head coach at Duke after Coach Roof had been fired. And so, Coach Cutcliffe gave me the opportunity to stay. He didn't fire me, and that was gracious of him to give me that opportunity to stay on his staff. And so I worked for about 6 months under Coach Cutcliffe and that staff before I moved into financial services. And I went to work at Merrill Lynch. That was September of 2008, which, you know, a lot of people joke with me about my timing on making that change. You know, I got hired on a Tuesday, and then on Sunday, that was around the time that Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, the big financial institutions started struggling there. And Merrill Lynch, we were one of them, and Bank of America bought us on that Sunday, less than a week after I started. And that was how I got started with that. And that's what I've been doing ever since. I've been with Merrill Lynch since September of 2008. So this is year 15 for me in financial services. And yeah, it's been a great career. I've loved staying in Durham, still being, you know, connected to the university, but not making my living working for the university anymore. But yeah, that's kind of what I've been up to.
A couple of things that I want to follow up on you with. I've had a player from every era of Duke football on, going back to Coach Shirley Wilson, but I've not had a player who played under Roof, but you coached with Roof. So now I've got that gap filled. Tell us a little bit about what Coach Roof was like.
Well, I really thought a lot of Coach Roof. You know, I think he's an outstanding football coach, and you know, I understand that a lot of times we look at a head football coach's record and we're quick to judge his abilities based on that. And you know, in all fairness, that's ultimately what it's about in a lot of cases. But you know, Coach Roof, you know, when you look at the body of his work, I mean, he won a national championship at Auburn. You know, he coordinated that defense and shut down Oregon's offense in that national title game. You know, he's had a lot of success coaching on defense at a lot of different places. And, you know, so I think he's actually an outstanding football coach. He was a young first-time head coach at Duke, and so he was really a guy who could relate well to players. You know, he was a very good recruiter, and you know, I really have a lot of respect for him.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the other thing that I wanted to ask you about that you mentioned. And actually, there were two other things. One, you mentioned the Duke lacrosse case, which I remember that was going on when I was in law school. What was the mood on the campus like at that point in time when all that was going on? And then how did the lacrosse team deal with it? I mean, I remember reading Coach Pressler's book about it, but just generally, what was the mood on the campus like? And then how did the team deal with it?
Well, it was, you know, it was a time that was hard for me personally, because the players who were accused of that, you know, were my players, and you know, it was challenging to see them going through that adversity, and you know, to see them just struggling with what they had been accused of, and just how unfortunately, I don't think it was really a great moment for Duke University in terms of how our players were treated. You know, hindsight's 2020 with a lot of this stuff, but unfortunately, I don't think it was one of our proudest moments as a university in terms of how, you know, there was a lack of support for those student athletes, and unfortunately, there was a lack of support for Coach Pressler, who had become a friend of mine. We hunted and fished together, and so that was a challenging time, you know, in a lot of ways. And, you know, I guess I think everyone's kind of moved on and is doing well in life years later, but it was a hard time.
Yeah, I remember that being one of those things that, being in law school at the time, it reiterated how important the presumption of innocence is, especially as an attorney. But also, it was, I guess, kind of one of the first early stage social media rush to judgment kind of in a college campus that I remember, and I'm probably forgetting some other things, but it seemed like the start of a lot of what we see now, which are rush to judgment before we get all the facts in.
Yeah.
And those of you who have not read Coach Pressler's book, I would commend that to you highly. That was very informative. I would recommend you take the time to read it. The next thing I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned going into the financial services field in September of 2008. My class graduated from law school. We've got our 15-year reunion coming up, but we graduated in the summer of 08.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point in time, people were just starting to hear about these things called deferments, okay, where instead of coming to work for a big law firm, you would take a year off at like half pay and then come in later. The class that came after us in 09, that really hit them. But kind of what's going through your mind is, in many respects, the career you're trying to walk into, the building is burning all around you. I mean, what was that like?
Well, it was, it was stressful because, I just left a career where I sort of felt like I knew what I was doing. I'd been in football for a while, and I was comfortable in football. I was stepping into this new industry, into, a position where it was a sales position, and an advice position, and kind of those two roles together. And I felt much more comfortable on the advice side than I did on the sales side. And, you're in an environment where you're trying to develop new business, and there's your firm is dealing with a lot of bad publicity, and not to mention just a lot of cynicism about the industry in general. So it was challenging. I think that people ask me sometimes, like, what do you really take away from your experience as a Duke football player? And I think one of the experiences I take away is just the fact that I've never really expected success to come easy. Like, we had a lot of difficult Saturday afternoons, and it wasn't a situation where we just had things work out quickly and easily. And I think that pretty well describes my career in financial services. I mean, I made 5,000 cold calls, and that's not times I dialed the phone. That is literally people I talked to who said no before I opened my first account. Now, if you think about that, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people saying no, and that phone got quite heavy after a while. And I think that, honestly, if I hadn't been through some of the disappointment, some of the frustration that I dealt with in my football career, just the failure, the criticism, just dealing with criticism, which is such a big part of football. I think that if I hadn't really experienced that, I may have quit. I may have just, not walked in the office and picked up the phone again to, get in there and swing the bat again for 30 or 40 conversations. But I really do think that experience in football helped me. And, like I said, it's been a great career. I had a good advisor when I was playing professional ball who was a good mentor to me and encouraged me. And, that's really how I felt like I was excited about getting into that as an industry.
Well, you went from strength and conditioning, from sports to financial services, very different things. Did you find that your membership in the Duke Alumni Network was helpful in you making that transition?
Not really, because, most of my friends, we were still relatively young. I mean, I was 31 when I started, and, a lot of my friends weren't really in a position to do much investing at that point in time. And a lot of the guys that I had played with in pro football, or the guys that I had coached with or played for, I really started, talking to some coaches, but they already, most of them already had an advisor that they were pretty comfortable working with, and, had been working with for a while. So, there wasn't, you hear the term low hanging fruit. I mean, there wasn't really wasn't really any low hanging fruit. After about 3 months of me kind of going through my Rolodex, that's where I pretty much determined that I had to, start cold calling. And that's really how I built my business.
Well, did it, I'm just curious, did it help open doors for you eventually at all? I mean, I've heard a lot from other guys who've come on and said it's helped them in situations. Did you find that it helped much at all, being able to have the Duke brand behind your name?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has over time, certainly over time, it has helped. And, kind of being in this area for as long as I've been in this area now, I think it has helped. I guess I was referring earlier just to, maybe the first couple years of doing it and kind of getting started with things. But yes, to answer your question, over time, it really has.
I think I may not have asked the most ideal question on that, so I will take the fall for asking a poor one. But you mentioned when we were setting this up and we were able to talk, you were in the midst of still coaching to some extent. So you coach your kids some still, is that right?
I do. Yeah, I really still enjoy working with youngsters, and we've got 3 children, and I've enjoyed coaching them and everything from soccer to basketball to baseball and softball. And I'm involved with the training they do for their tennis teams and swim teams. And so I really enjoyed staying involved in youth athletics. I don't play golf. I don't hunt and fish anymore, so this is really my hobby. And, I guess I kind of feel like that while I've got this time with them, I've got a window with them. That's really how I want to invest into them. And, my dad really, my dad and my mother both really did that with me. And, I think it was instrumental in helping me as a young man, and even in the elementary and middle school, high school years.
What's the hardest part that you find in regard to coaching your kids? Our daughter's been harder for us to coach in soccer. And we usually have to if we want to make suggestions about do this or do that, we have to convey it through another coach. I'm just curious kind of what's been the most challenging aspect of it for you.
I find baseball to be the hardest sport to coach with young kids. And it's several things. It's a lot of them, they don't have the strength yet to throw the ball across the infield, to throw someone out at first base. They don't yet have the strength to do that. And then there's the strength aspect that's lacking for them. It's a technical, it's definitely a technical sport to coach, in that, like I find myself correcting how they're standing in the batter's box, and it's kind of difficult to verbally communicate how to do it sometimes. So you have to physically move them, in the batter's box. And then even just, before the ball is in play, when you're on defense, explaining to them where to go with the ball when they do, if it does come to them. There's the element of a lot of times they're not sure what to do when the ball comes to them, or their attention span is not at a level where they're really dialed in, and basketball, soccer, for example, I don't find that the kids struggle with attention as much as they do in baseball. I can't count how many times I've been out there coaching baseball, and, a kid who I thought was ready to field a ground ball isn't even looking in that direction when the ball is hit to him. So it's just, I find baseball to be the hardest one to coach.
Yeah, and it's interesting you picked up on the attention span. And I may not have had much of an attention span when I was a kid either, but I do wonder, with access to smartwatches and smartphones, if that makes it harder for them to, sit sort of still for the most part of a baseball game during 9 innings. But my kids never got interested in baseball, so I haven't been able to find out. But yeah, I'm not surprised that that's what you mentioned.
Yeah.
Well, let's transition a little bit. since you grew up in Roanoke, is it a great place to be a kid, or is it the greatest place to be a kid? Those are your two options.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, as far as my experience, it was the greatest place. Roanoke for me was a wonderful place to grow up. As far as sports goes, I think I was lucky in the sense that as a high school kid there at that time, at least you could get a decent amount of exposure in the newspapers, because contrast it with like metropolitan DC. I mean, there were several schools in the Roanoke Valley, but I mean, we were written about in the paper pretty much every game, whether it was basketball or football or track. I mean, we were getting a lot of exposure. So I think from that perspective, it was really good. I mean, I miss a lot of things about Roanoke. I miss, my wife and I are both from Roanoke. She went to Cave Spring High School. And, we were high school sweethearts, but, we miss the mountains a lot about Roanoke. I mean, we love living in Durham, but the geography of Roanoke, we miss a lot. We miss the four seasons. Down here, you really don't have much of a spring down here in Durham, compared to Roanoke, where there's kind of four solid seasons. And I mean, it was just a great, strong public school system. Growing up there, I mean, had really good teachers, good administrators in the schools, from Fishburne Park Elementary to Madison Middle School to Patrick Henry High School. I mean, all that was a positive experience for me. My grandfather on my mother's side was involved in the community and in his church. So we were, and with Fellowship of Christian Athletes, he was involved with that. And my dad was involved in the community. He had a small business there. And so there was, a lot of positive things about Roanoke for my older brother and for me.
Well, you mentioned you went to PH, as we call it here, and people from Roanoke call it PH.
Yeah.
Your wife went to Cave Spring.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting how many high schools there are here that are like stone's throw from each other.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I'm curious. Would you guys sneak over to Stanley Avenue for Halloween?
Yes. South Roanoke was kind of where everyone wanted to hang out. And I can remember growing up, playing football down at that fire station. That was the big place to go play football. Growing up, we'd have big pickup games of football in that big yard out there in front of that fire station. So that was South Roanoke was a fun place to hang out.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. We live in what has been repeatedly described to us as the Kemper House, and everybody knows it as, which is one of the interesting things about South Roanoke, is everybody refers to it as somebody else's house who lived there, one or two people before you did.
Yeah, right.
So my wife and I are determined to scrub the name Kemper House from the lexicon, but we'll see.
Yeah. It'll be the birdhouse here.
Exactly. It's South Roanoke's great because everybody can run around. The kids can go down to the 7-Eleven. They can go play at River's Edge, and they can have a lot of freedom. It's just a nice little, neighborhood. And, with kids who get hurt, you're right next to a level 1 trauma center, right?
That's right. That's right.
There's a lot of great things. It's just a fun place to be. We've really liked our time here. We've been here since 2008, and it's been a blast. You mentioned a lot of sports you played, though. What all did you play when you were in high school?
Well, I played football in the fall. I played basketball in the winter, and then ran track in the spring. And I think I see so many kids specializing in one sport now at a relatively young age, and it kind of pains me a little bit, because I think of all the positive experiences I had playing basketball and running track. And, if I had specialized in football early, I would have missed out on those things. And, that, I think it's really unfortunate that a lot of these kids are doing that at such a young age. But yeah, my dad, I'm not sure if you're aware. I mean, he had a great career in basketball, and so that's really what I grew up playing mostly, was that. And then track was something that really I started getting involved with because I knew that I needed to get faster, for football and for basketball. And really the track athletes would train a lot in the weight room, so it was a sport that really complemented football and basketball well. And it was great. I mean, it was a great experience being on the Patrick Henry track teams.
Well, you mentioned your dad, and I read an article to prepare for this evening. It mentioned that your dad was in the Virginia Tech Athletics Hall of Fame. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I also saw that you didn't really get recruited by Tech, and that did not sit well with the old man. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think, like, in a nutshell, my dad was in school with Coach Beamer, and they were there at the same time, and athletes were kind of living together more or less there at that time. And Coach Beamer was actually at that ceremony where Dad got inducted into the Hall of Fame. And so kind of grew up a big Hokie fan, spending a lot of time in Blacksburg, both at football games in the fall and at basketball games in the winter. So that's sort of where I visualize myself ending up. And I think Tech, when I was coming through as a high school player, I mean, I think they had a lot of good players on the defensive line. And I was kind of a thin guy coming out of high school, and I don't think a lot of schools really thought I could get big enough to play defensive tackle. So it was probably a situation where Tech just didn't really see that happening, and probably didn't think I had the speed to play defensive end or tight end. And so it's like, what do you do with them? And I think that's sort of what happened. And who knows what would have happened if I'd ended up in Blacksburg? We'll never know. But I don't have any hard feelings at this point. I mean, Coach Beamer actually wrote me a really nice letter when I got drafted by the Steelers. And I stayed in touch a while with his son Shane. We played in the East-West game together. Shane and I are the same year, and so I stayed in touch with Shane for a while. And we're friendly and everything. Of course, he's doing great things down at University of South Carolina now, and that's great. And I mean, I've seen Coach Beamer several times since then. Back when we were coaching against Tech, when I was back at Duke, and several other times. And continue to wish him and Shane nothing but the best.
Well, you mentioned playing tight end a little bit. I saw that UVA had some interest in you playing tight end. Is that accurate?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, what I remember about being recruited by UVA was just they didn't tell me exactly, hey, here's where you're going to play. They said, we think you could play here, or maybe here or here, and we're going to bring you in, and we'll see how things fit. So I think initially that was one of the positions where they considered starting me. And UVA had, similar to Tech, they had a lot of good players on the defensive side of the ball during that era.
Well, eventually you end up at Duke, which was great for us. Tell us a little bit how you ended up there. What made you decide to go to Duke?
Well, it was a situation where my first two offers came from Duke and UVA, and I really, academically, I thought those were two schools where I could get a great education and play in the ACC. So I was excited about that. Of course, at that time, Coach Goldsmith, Fred Goldsmith, who was our head coach, had just become the head coach the year that I was getting recruited. And he really took a lot of personal interest in me during the recruiting process. And he really got to know my parents well. And, I think that he kind of, whereas earlier you mentioned UVA sort of had interest in me as a tight end. Coach Goldsmith maybe had a little more clarity on where he saw me fitting into his program. Now, ultimately that changed because I moved from defensive end to defensive tackle, but I think it was a combination of just the personal interest he took in me. And then I thought I would have a chance to play earlier at Duke. I was the type of person where I was interested in, getting on the field as soon as I could. And of course, everyone is, but, I think that the odds of me getting on the field as a freshman at UVA would have been, or, some other schools, it would have been harder. And maybe it would have happened, but we'll never know. And, I got to start for 4 years at Duke. So I got to play a lot of football, and I had a great position coach there, a guy named Scott Brown, and Coach Goldsmith. It was very much like a family atmosphere with them. So I guess really how I ended up there was a combination of just the academic reputation of Duke. My parents told me, they said, if you have a chance to go there to get in, you really need to consider that, because that's a top 10 school, and football's going to be your only ticket to get in there. I was a pretty good student, but I wasn't going to get into Duke just based on my academic merit alone at that point in time.
Well, it's funny you say that. I had kind of a similar experience when I went to W&L for law school, and I'm not knocking any other place that I'd been, but when I sat in that law school class and started listening and looking around, I said, wow, not that I was in camp. I guess you would say, well, I'm not in South Carolina anymore, but it was a noticeable difference. And I audited a couple of undergrad classes when I was over there, and I could not believe the difference in the level of academics from where I went to college versus what they were expecting from those students at W&L. And from everybody that I've talked to, it sounds like the same thing for you guys at Duke. Could you talk a little bit about the academic side of things?
Sure. One of the memories I have is when I got there as a freshman, we were all sitting in the locker room, and at that time, Dr. Chris Kennedy, he was an associate athletics director there for a long time. And at that time in 1995, when we got there, he was almost single-handedly managing the academic support for student athletes. It wasn't a big enterprise like it is now. It was a few people doing a lot of work with not a whole lot of resources. And I kind of laugh about this now, because he had us in there and he said, now, how many of you are pre-med? And, a ton of hands shot up in the air. It was guys that came in with me as freshmen, and a bunch of them were pre-med. I was not pre-med, but a lot of them were. And, he immediately kind of grinned, and he said, well, as soon as you guys take organic chemistry, we'll find out how many of you are still pre-med. So, that was the course that weeded a bunch of people out on that. But, there were some guys that I tell you, in hindsight, I have tremendous respect for the guys I played with that ended up going the medical route. Several of them ended up as surgeons, or they went the engineering route, where, there was such a commitment academically for someone who's not a football player, much less someone who's got, the kind of time intensive commitments that we had as football players with, travel on the weekends, plus you're just not feeling well a lot of the times because you're banged up. It's just a challenging type of thing to perform academically at a place like that, especially when you're not feeling, you're just not feeling very well, or you're tired, you're worn out. And those guys, they were big time performers in the classroom. I was more interested in the business route. And it was not easy for me by any stretch of the imagination, but I sort of put my teammates who were on the medical and the engineering track on a different level in terms of what they had to do in the classroom.
Well, you mentioned some of the doctors you played with. I remember Spencer Romine at quarterback. comes to mind. Especially, God, and we could talk more about this later, but having talked about it with some of your other teammates, it just seemed like he was always getting beat up, and he and Campbell, and I can't remember the other fella whose name is passing me by, but let's go a little bit into your seasons at Duke. The 5 years you were there. First with Coach Goldsmith. After coming off the high of the bowl game, the two coordinators leave, and then Goldsmith can't ever really recapture that magic. And it always seems like, looking back on it, he was breaking in a new offensive coordinator every year. You guys on the defensive side of the ball seemed a little bit more stable, though, with the staff. But you go 3-8, 0-11, 2-9, 4-7. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about was that the 0-11 year. One of the things Goldsmith said was you guys went, at that point, were really, really young. And he in his book, he talked about how he didn't have a lot of guys, and he felt like he was playing a team that he was just desperate to put pounds on to get them to be able to make weight, basically. Does that generally match with your recollection of that season and what went on with it?
Yeah, I mean, 1996 was my first year on the field. I'd redshirted in 95, so 1996 was my first year playing, and we had some good players in 1995 who graduated, who were on that bowl team, and so really in 1996 it was a lot of us were starting for the first time or getting significant playing time for the first time, and unfortunately that showed up. And I think we individually got better. I mean, if you look at just the path of a lot of us individually, we had several guys go on to NFL careers, but I can't say that we had the win-loss record to really support the success that some of us had individually. And there's a number of reasons for that, but there was plenty of blame to go around. I'm sorry to say.
Well, it seemed like, even though the win-loss record may not, reflect this, but after that season, it seemed like Goldsmith was slowly starting to rebuild you guys and rebuild the team. I mean, if you look at 97, again, 2-9 is something you would probably not want to write home to your parents about, but there were a couple of really close losses there. You lost by 4 to Northwestern, 6 to Maryland. I still hate Maryland. 3 to Virginia. And I look, the Terrapins aren't in the conference, but I just still despise Maryland. I just cannot root for them. You lost an overtime game to Clemson, at Clemson, and then lost by 3 to Georgia Tech. I mean, looking back on it, you can kind of see the makings of, maybe Goldsmith wasn't as far away as the administration started to think that 97 year, and we could go into the 98 year, which we will, with some even closer losses. But how were you all feeling after you get that winless season, the taste of that out of your mouth? How do you feel over the next couple of seasons?
Well, I think, I was starting to develop a lot of confidence because I was gaining experience, and I was starting to have some success. And, I really had, a group of guys around me that, we were pretty confident about how we could perform out there against whoever we were playing, really. And it sounds silly because of what you said. We only won a couple of games, but to your point, if you break down a lot of those losses, they were close games. And I think what I learned in football, and this was true in the NFL as well, there's so many games that pretty much come down to the last 4 minutes of the game, and it's really about maybe 5 or 6 plays that are pretty instrumental in that margin of victory or margin of defeat. And a lot of those games we just didn't seem to have the kind of plays that we were making at the end, either on offense or defense, to come out on top. And I think that maybe there was a psychological component to that. I mean, I never dealt with that. I can honestly say I took the field every game. I played 44 games at Duke. We only played 11 game seasons. I believed we were going to win every time I stepped out there. And I convinced myself of that. I tell people that and they think I'm crazy, but every time we took the field, I fully believed we were going to win the game because of the preparation that I'd put in, and my defensive line coach, Scott Brown, had invested into me during the week. I fully believed it. And, it becomes hard to reconvince yourself of that after you're not experiencing that success. But I think that it was a combination of some of us were developing confidence, but then what starts to happen is the guys who were starting to get older and they're not getting much playing time and we're losing, those fellas, they started to kind of get negative, I guess, for lack of a better term. I mean, if you're not playing much and your team's losing, you can either sort of point the finger at yourself or you can point the finger at other people. Well, it's the coach's fault. It's I should be in a different scheme. And we didn't have the transfer portal then, so everyone hung around. And so there was some negativity that came a lot from guys who weren't playing very much.
Well, one thing too that I remember about that era was it felt like you guys would hang on, and then probably by about the middle of the third quarter, things would start to slip away. Like either you'd have a penalty that pushed your field goal attempt back, and you had a good kicker then, and Lenhart, or you would just have some guy get loose or a guy would slip or something. And one thing that I've heard from, and then the game would get away a lot of times. But one thing that I've heard from the guys I've spoken with in from your era is depth always would turn into an issue as the season went on. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on that part of it.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I mean, I think that, I'll speak for myself. I did play a lot of football. Probably at times I played too much football, and at the end of the season I was tired because because I didn't come out a whole lot, and I got injured some. So one of the benefits to playing as a freshman is you get a lot of experience, but by the time you're a senior, if you've played that much football and you've been through spring practice, that many times, then and you're playing in the interior line, more than likely you're going to sustain some kind of injury. And I sustained multiple injuries, and so I think the depth was part of the problem.
One thing I think that one of your teammates said was that you had to eat like an animal all throughout your time at Duke to stay in the tackle position. I'm just curious what that process was like for you.
Well, it was a good problem to have. I mean, I can't complain. We had a training table, and you had a meal plan where you could order takeout, and so it was a great problem to have. I've tried to lose a lot of that weight now, and fortunately I've been able to. So it was hard for me to put it on, and it was easy to take off about the first 20 after I stopped playing, but it's been a discipline to lose the rest of it and keep the rest of it off, because a lot of us would, in that environment, there's just food everywhere you go. I mean, you would get on the bus to go to the airport and there's a hamburger, and you're on the plane to travel and there's a meal, and then you get off the plane to go to the hotel and there's a chicken sandwich, and then you get to the hotel and there's a team dinner, and then the next morning, there's just food constantly around. And so it's been so hard for a lot of my teammates, especially guys that I played with in the NFL, to really have the discipline and the portion control to step away from that type of intake, because they're not working. Most of them aren't working out anymore, and it's like they're eating the way they always used to eat, and they're just not working out anymore. And I've I always enjoyed working out, and so it's hadn't been a discipline for me to continue doing that. It's been more of a discipline with the portion control.
I gotcha. And it's interesting. My son's on the go all the time. He's playing lacrosse right now, and God, I swear we're about to go bankrupt. Keeping him fed. Yeah. We've been taking him his. My wife's parents, I think, run a burger or a chicken sandwich over to him after school, just so he can have something to eat. He's a little bit embarrassed by it, but we just keep telling him, you're going to be practicing for 2 hours. You need it,
Exactly.
Exactly. There were, speaking of confidence that you displayed, there was one question I wanted to ask you about. I came across an article and it talked about how you didn't want your career to be defined by one play. And I said, oh my God, Chris must have done something terrible. I mean, he must have just clotheslined somebody like McHale and Rambis, or it was like a Bill Lambier play. And okay, what I saw was that you sacked UVA's quarterback, turned away from the entire team, did not even face the UVA sideline, and did a salute, I guess, to the Duke fans. Who knows? And then that resulted in an unsportsmanlike penalty, which allowed UVA to keep the chains moving, and then they kicked a field goal and won. Now, the phrase that I would use to describe that is garbage. I don't want to put an explicit rating on the podcast, so I won't do anything more, but I couldn't believe the way that things were written about differently back then. Given now, it seems like there are players who are, we could talk about what's going on in Alabama basketball as a good comparison and contrast to that.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you want to, it's been a while. Why don't you go ahead and tell us what you really think about that penalty?
Oh man. Well, I was expecting this to come up. I mean, it's I tell my kids, a lot of times people will remember you for the mistakes you make, more so than they'll remember you for anything good that you did. And that's just life. And I can't tell you, Ben, how many times over the last, that happened in 1997. That was my sophomore year when that happened up in Charlottesville. So it's been over 25 years ago. I can't tell you how many people in Durham remember that and talk to me about that. And it's just amazing to me how many people remember it. I mean, it wasn't like it was the national championship game. I mean, it was a kind of a game in the middle. I think it was maybe in the middle of October between two teams, in the ACC, but people around here have remembered that, it's just, and I think, I guess a couple things I'd say. One is I wish that's one of those where I just wish I had it to do over and hadn't done anything. I mean, I can honestly say it was a spontaneous type of thing. I didn't plan it. I just got excited. It happened. And, I wish I hadn't have done it, obviously, now. But, the thing that I appreciated was Coach Goldsmith and Coach Bob Trott, who was our defensive coordinator, and Scott Brown, our defensive line coach. They really stood by me during that time. And that really deepened my loyalty to them even more so. That was my sophomore year. And so that really made me even more loyal to them because they stood by me during a time that was, I had made a mistake. I'd gotten called for it. And, we could debate about whether I should have been penalized or not, but, they could have easily just kind of thrown me under the bus with the whole thing. And they didn't. They kind of stood up for me publicly. And I really appreciated that. And, it's funny. I mean, I was in the Wendy's I was in Wendy's on Hillsborough Road here in Durham, like the day after that. And I'll tell a couple more stories and then we can move on, quick ones. And it was the day after that game, and this guy didn't recognize me. And he said, I can't believe that Combs kid, yesterday and everything he did. Can you believe that? And I think I said something like, yeah, I know. And he said, well, it's too bad he didn't play for West Point. Then they wouldn't have penalized him. So that was one was one thing. And then later on, he saw me at the postseason banquet and recognized me. We're wearing helmets, so a lot of times people didn't recognize us, but he came up and apologized. But then fast forward to Jacksonville, my last year, I got a sack, and we're in the meeting room after the game, the next day or something, watching the tape, and the guys on the defensive line, Marcus Stroud and John Henderson and Tony Bracken, some of these really good players that Jacksonville had at that time. They're like, Combs, why don't you do something, like celebrate, do something after you get a sack. And this guy from UVA, his name was Chris Luzar. He was a tight end for the Jaguars. And he goes, we were in the training room after that and they were still talking about it. And he goes, well, I know why he's not doing anything. I know exactly why Combs isn't doing anything. And, that whole experience kind of scarred me. And so, I was pretty low key to begin with, I think, but, I made that one mistake. And after that, man, just let me go back to the huddle.
I mean, you can call it a mistake. I'm going to call it just just one of many instances of Duke football getting screwed over by the officials. The only reason I'm talking about it is because really I thought it was this quaint historical discussion about the relative values of football and celebrations and all that have clearly changed completely since then. But it just seems like a crazy thing to penalize somebody for. I mean, you weren't taunting anybody. You didn't do anything aggressive. It just seemed so weird, looking back on it. And it was a 3-point game. It would have been a big win, or at least a force overtime, on the road.
Yeah. I mean, I met the official who made the call after that, and I think he said something to the effect of, I'm sorry that I had to make that call. I mean, that was, I'm kind of paraphrasing it. That's what I remember him saying, something to that effect. And I don't know if that was an apology or just sort of, hey, I hate that I did what I needed to do and that it affected you. But, that's sort of what was said between him and me about that. I don't think he really admitted he was wrong or anything like that. He didn't have to throw the flag, but he did. And I mean, who knows what would have happened? I mean, the guy would have had a longer field goal. Maybe he would have hit it. Maybe he wouldn't have. We'll never know. If I recall, the way it turned out, after they hit the field goal, we went down the field and fumbled it, and that ended the game. So we had another chance to score, and we just couldn't, get it done. But without a doubt, my penalty didn't help our cause. I mean, it gave the guy a closer field goal.
Well, it boggles my mind how different things were not too terribly long ago. But turning the corner to 98, you talked about how confident you felt every game, and we could talk about the flu game, Florida State and all that, which I would like to hear about. But what's the mood going into that season?
Well, going into that season, I think that, we had played, a lot of us had played together for a couple years. And, like you were saying about 1997, we sensed that we were close and, that we could really make some plays, and a few things happen differently, and maybe we're in a bowl game. I do remember having that feeling kind of going into the junior year there in 1998 about, we're pretty close here, and there's so many games that could go either way. The difference between us winning 2 games and winning 6 games in 1997, it probably wasn't that much. It's just that we didn't do what we needed to do down the stretch to win those games. But, if we could create some momentum in 1998, I remember having the feeling that, we could go to a bowl game.
Well, talk a little bit about the flu game against the Seminoles, which older fans know exactly what we're talking about. And then I want to come back to a couple of games in the 98 season, to your point about how close you guys were to turning that corner.
Yeah. Well, at that time, if memory serves, we had beaten Northwestern on the road.
Correct.
And beaten them pretty convincingly.
44-10, not bad.
Yeah. And, then, so if memory serves, that was our next game. That we went from we had just beaten Northwestern pretty bad. And then we went down to Tallahassee. And, like I mentioned earlier, I was, Florida State, that they were in their heyday at that time. I mean, that was, they were at the top of the food chain in the world of college football. And, we had every reason to believe that we could never go down there and do anything. But, I mentioned earlier, I had a coach on the defensive line. He was a great motivator. He challenged us, just in all kinds of ways. And he just created in me a belief that I could compete, and it didn't matter who I was playing against. And, that was valuable for me. And so when we went down there, I honestly thought, hey, now we've proven to ourselves that we can win. We just beat Northwestern, and who knows what happens down here. I mean, I think Florida State might have just lost to NC State when we went down there to play them. And so maybe you can fact check me on that. But
I'm doing that. You're right. Yeah, they lost 24-7.
Yeah, it seems like they had just lost to NC State. And so it was a combination of us winning against Northwestern and seeing that they had lost to NC State. And now we're thinking, well, I mean, they're beatable. Obviously this is not going to be easy. We have no reason to be overconfident or arrogant about this by any stretch, but they're a team that could lose. And, who knows? And so, but what happened down there was, we all got food poisoning. I think it's been written up in medical journals. This group of my former teammates who I still stay in touch with were texting about that not long ago. And, there were guys that got deathly ill who had like a few bites of this turkey sandwich that we had as like the meal, before we left to travel. Well, I ate 2 sandwiches, so you can imagine how I felt. I had a mega dose of all that, and I was one of the first to get really sick during the game. But this is back to, I keep talking about my coach. I did not come out of that game. I was throwing up. I was taking IVs at halftime. And in hindsight, I think to myself, how did I physically do that? And the belief that he put in us that we could push ourselves physically through limits, that's how it happened. I mean, I played in the second half in that game after throwing up violently in the pregame and just kind of continuing to feel terrible. And sorry to be so graphic, but yeah, that was what I remember about my experience. I remember my dad coming in the locker room at halftime, like thinking, "What's the matter with you? You're looking terrible." And then I'm thinking, "What are you doing in here, Dad?" But the rest of us were all sick, and the plane flight home, it was just an awful scene. We were all, there's trash bags all over the plane, people just sick all the flight home, coaches. It was just an ugly scene. And, of course we lost the game. And, I think the reason it's been written about in medical journals is because FSU went to Southern Cal the week after that to play, and like a bunch of their players had to miss the game. And I think it was written about because it was like the first game where one team had given another team a virus, like just by playing the game. And I remember at the All ACC, that was my junior year, and at the All ACC banquet, down in Atlanta after that season. I was down there, and these guys started saying, how in the world did you play? You know, these were guys that had to miss the Southern Cal game or drop out of it. And I'm like, I was scared not to play, playing for this guy I'm playing for. but yeah, that was a tough evening down there in Tallahassee. It's not easy playing there under the best of conditions.
Yeah, they were good that year too. They were 11-2 and made it to the BCS national title, where they lost to Tennessee.
Well, yeah, that's right. And then they won the whole thing next year.
Yeah, they were good. Checks notes. They were pretty good back then.
Yeah, my senior year in #99, they won the whole thing. They beat Virginia Tech in the title game. And yeah, I mean, they were number one or right there my whole time in college.
Yeah, they were really good. But you mentioned NC State had beat them. You guys lost by a field goal to NC State. You lose by a field goal to Vanderbilt. You finish the year 4-7. Those two games go differently. You're bowl eligible. I don't know if you guys would have gone back then. I can't remember how comparatively difficult it was to get into a bowl, but 6-5 would have looked pretty good, certainly, especially where you all had been. What's the mood at the end of the season?
Well, it was depressing because Coach Goldsmith got fired, and he was, I mentioned earlier, he was kind of like there was a family atmosphere. He had been very involved in recruiting me. I was very loyal to him. He was really good to me. So I was really upset about the fact that he'd been fired, and it was just kind of an indication of just how much we had struggled. And so that I'd say that was a low point. Certainly one of them when he got fired.
Did you know at any point during the season that a coaching change was coming? I think in his book he had said he started to get kind of a weird vibe at some point with Oliva being the AD. And while he was disappointed, I think what he was trying to say was he wasn't totally shocked when it happened. Did you guys ever get a feeling that before it was announced that something was going to change?
Well, I did start to hear people talk about the possibility of a change. And I was the type of person that, maybe it's because I was so loyal to him and I didn't want a change to happen. And maybe it was because I just was focused on what I could control and preparing for the games that I had to play, that I just didn't really try to give it a whole lot of thought. But, I could, earlier I mentioned some of the guys that weren't playing very much were starting to make some noise. And that my parents would hear things. They would tell me, like, from other parents about, well, if the boys had a different coach, maybe things would be better around here, that type of thing. And my parents sort of had the same mentality I did. They didn't want to hear that because they really liked Coach Goldsmith. And I think I was pretty upset about the possibility of a change, because I knew that if a change happened, that it would likely cause a new head coach to fire the defensive staff. And my defensive line coach, Scott Brown, was a second father to me. And, that was like something I couldn't even comprehend, was playing a season without him. At that time, I didn't even want to think about that. Now, fortunately, when Coach Franks came in, he retained our defensive staff and Coach Brown and Coach Trott. And that was like the biggest gift that he could have given me. Not that he did it for me, but that was a gift to have those guys coach me my senior year.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the '99 season. Just kind of broad brush. Duke goes 3-8, and it looked like the offense was never particularly comfortable in Franks' system. Defense stayed more or less the same because you had continuity there. You had some good players on that unit, but just if you can, that 1 year under Franks, what was that year like?
I really, it's sort of like I said earlier with Coach Roof. I had a good experience with Coach Franks. I realized that his win-loss record ultimately wasn't what we all hoped it would be, and that's why he was, that's why he was let go. I appreciated, like I said a minute ago, the fact that he retained the guys that were coaching me on defense, and we had continuity. I think we had a lot of pretty good players on defense, and so I was excited about just getting to play with my teammates for my senior year. And we had some good players on offense, like Scotty Montgomery was a guy at receiver who was a good ACC player, and Richmond Flowers was a good ACC player. So at the receiver position, I think we had some guys who were above average ACC receivers. And when I say that, I say it with respect, because we had we had Florida State. There were a lot of good receivers in the ACC in those years. So we had some guys who could play, and I think a lot of us were optimistic about the system that Coach Franks was coming from at the University of Florida. We expected that the system that he was going to implement would be successful, because if the University of Florida was having so much success. I mean, they won a national title during that era in '96, I believe it was, when they beat FSU in the title game. So, and that was maybe naive on our part to expect that system was really going to take us to another level. I mean, ultimately, we had to have the personnel to execute the system. And as you said, we needed, they probably needed more time for the system to work out. And it just didn't we weren't able to execute it very well, unfortunately. And I mean, we could have played better on defense. It wasn't all the offense's fault.
Well, you also you talked about your offensive players. You guys had Ben Watson there for a year. I mean, I don't know how he was allowed to leave Durham.
Yeah, he was one. I remember Ben, and he was a true freshman, and that was my 5th year, and you could tell he was at a different level physically. I mean, I remember the first time I collided with him in one of those inside run periods, and it may have been a stalemate, but I said to myself, this guy is solid. And obviously he had a fantastic NFL career. He's, I haven't stayed in touch with him, unfortunately, but it's been, great to see him do so well and in all areas of his life.
Well, what was Coach Franks like in comparison to Coach Goldsmith, as far as kind of overall approach to the program, hands-on, 30,000 foot view type guy, or just generally what was different about him as compared to Coach Goldsmith?
Well, I think their personalities are very different. Coach Goldsmith was a pretty gregarious kind of guy. He would lighthearted, he liked to joke around a little bit. Coach Goldsmith was pretty outspoken about his faith, his Christian faith, which appealed to me. But, there were some guys on our team that it didn't appeal to very much. Coach Franks was quieter, more reserved. He wasn't as, he was not as outspoken or outgoing, I would say, just his personality. But back to, I think we all respected him because of what he had accomplished as a player at Duke, and, what he had, the type of system he was coming from. I mean, he had my respect when I was playing for him. So different styles. And, I think you see that a lot in coaching. I mean, you think of Bob Knight and John Wooden. I mean, two men who couldn't be more different personality wise. They both won a lot of basketball games. And, people ask me sometimes, how could Tony Dungy, win football games the way that he did with his personality? I mean, he had his players' respect. So I think different coaches can earn their players' respect And Coach Franks, he was a first-time head coach, but he had Steve Spurrier's endorsement, which I think got our attention. And and I played for him for a year. I was able to play for him for 1 year, and then I moved on, and I was around him a little bit after that, but not a whole lot after that.
Looking back on your time at Duke, we've talked a little bit about it, and I've made this point a lot, but you had a bunch of different coaches come in after Spurrier, and really even before Spurrier, it's not like the program was doing that great. And, there's a lot of losses, not as many wins. It seemed like maybe the administration didn't really catch what the issue was and how the sport had evolved versus how Duke hadn't really evolved with football. And I'm just curious, as you went around to other ACC schools, did you notice a difference in facilities or administration support compared to other schools?
I did. Yeah. The joke that like some of the coaches told me was like when they got to Duke in this would have been like 1996, they didn't even have voicemail. So like, to think that you're like recruiting college football player or high school football players to come to, a top 10 university, that this is what they were telling me after the fact in terms of as an assistant, what type of resources they had to work with. And the facilities, it was an issue. I think that like there's good and bad with how things have changed. I just coached basketball with this season with a lady who was an All-American women's player at Duke. And we were talking about the fact that, when we were in school, we all shared a weight room. We all shared a training room. We got to know each other. We interacted. There was a camaraderie between sports. And now it's like every sport has its own silo. Every sport has its own weight room, its own training room for the most part. And there's not a lot of interaction, and it's for recruiting. So I think it's good for recruiting. It's good for a lot of things. It's not necessarily the greatest thing in terms of college athletes having the total experience. But I think back to your comment, we were not operating on a level playing field in terms of facilities, and it's kind of like a vicious cycle where you've got to win games to get people into the stands, to build the facilities, and then you've got to recruit to have the players to win games, and recruits want to see that you've won. So, where does it all start? And I think everyone was thinking that, well, if we get the right coach, then it can all change. And, there have been some coaches in Duke's football history who've been able to have an impact. And we've seen Coach Cutcliffe had some great years of success. Coach Goldsmith had a year, and he was a 2-time National Coach of the Year. I think we've had, Coach Elko is obviously off to a great start with his tenure, and but I tell people, it's not an easy place to win because we had a lot of good coaches. Billy O'Brien was our offensive coordinator under Ted Roof. Billy has, he's been an NFL head coach. He's been a big time college head coach. He's been an offensive coordinator. He knows what he's doing. He was our offensive coordinator under Ted Roof, and we struggled to win a game. And we've had numerous assistants come through who've gone on to big time jobs, and it's just a tough place to win. I'm not making excuses, but it's not an easy place.
One of the things you mentioned too is the fan support, and we can talk about the Cutcliffe era, and especially last year with Coach Elko. You've got North Carolina, you got NC State, you got this private school where a lot of the alumni maybe don't stay, they go elsewhere. It does seem like it gets harder to get people back into the seats, especially for the football game, even when you're doing well. Part of that's the tradition of lack of success, but the fan appeal to the local market seems a little bit harder. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on maybe how to change that. Is it, going to the 3-5-5 schedule, getting more North Carolina teams for non-conference on the schedule? What do you think?
Well, that's a great question, Ben. I hadn't thought about, the scheduling more North Carolina teams out of conference. I mean, I see where you're going with that one for sure. And that
we used to play East Carolina a lot. It was a good rivalry,
Yeah, I mean, we used to play ECU. I mean, I couldn't tell you why that's not happening. I mean, I think you're right. That definitely makes some sense. And I would say that, like, for my family, it's so like for me, age 46, and I played there, I coached there, I'm invested. I mean, I've got skin in the game with Duke football. It means something to me. But in this stage of life that I'm in, a couple things. Number one, if my kids have a soccer game, or they've got some kind of activity at 1 or 12 o'clock on a Saturday and I'm coaching it, that's where I'm going to be, as opposed to going to Wallace Wade Stadium for 3 or 4 hours. So, for me at this stage of my life, my kids' activities take priority. And I'm a guy who's invested in Duke football. It means a lot to me. But it's still ultimately, my family's going to take priority at this chapter for me. So for someone like me, that's the first thing standing in the way of coming to the games. But I will say, I think that the university is making an effort to make it a family-friendly environment. I mean, my family likes going to the games. We lost to UVA 4 or 5 years ago at home, and I'm walking out of the stadium frustrated. And my daughter, who was like 8 at the time, she looks at me, she goes, "Daddy, this was just the greatest day. We got to come to watch Duke play. We got to, get our faces painted. We got to, go to the tailgate party. We got to jump in the bouncy house." And so I think they've done some things to make it family friendly. And my kids love going to the games. My wife likes going to the games. So I think, they're doing some things right. But, there's just so many entertainment options now. And so I don't know. I don't have all the answers. I still buy tickets, and when I can go, I go. And, but, it's kind of 50-50 for me a lot of times as to whether I'm going to go, and it's important to me. So that tells me that it's going to be hard for a lot of people to make it happen. Especially if they've got kids in our stage of life.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me, I need to figure out for my crew which game we're going to this year. And, for us, it's a almost 3-hour drive down there, 2.5 probably. And then, driving back, but it's a great place to watch a game. You get good seats, you can see the whole field.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful place, to go. So I look forward to getting back there, but quick thoughts on how last season went. I mean, it was a heck of a year. I know the schedule is going to be a lot tougher than it was last year. A lot of those teams that didn't make bowl games are not going to be on the schedule, but it should be a fun season nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, my hat's off to Coach Elko and his staff. I mean, put me in the camp of people that was sad about how Coach Cutcliffe's tenure ended, after all he had accomplished. But I couldn't be more thankful for the year that we had last year under Coach Elko's leadership. And, it's interesting that, like, he and I are the same age. So I'm sort of looking at him and thinking he's a guy that, we were contemporaries. I've had the opportunity to meet him, and, we know some of the same people. I had some teammates at Duke who ended up transferring to Penn, which is, of course, where he played, that we talk about them and various things. But, he's done a great job of bringing assistant coaches in who look to me like they're very good mentors for these young men. And, I think there were times where Coach Cutcliffe had very good assistant coaches, and then we saw some guys leave for really good opportunities, like Jim Knowles and several other coaches left, and it's tough to fill those positions. I think Coach Elko has got some really outstanding assistant coaches on his staff, and that really stood out to me as I watched them play this year. That this was a team that was well coached, well prepared, and that impressed me a lot. So I was really excited to see that, and this environment of name, image, and likeness. I mean, they brought a lot of us back this summer to explain that. Nina King and had an event, a former players weekend, and I'm starting to wrap my head around all that. But I think he's, in the rest of the program, or in Nina King, I think they're committed to giving him the resources that he needs to be successful through an assistant coach salary pool and a recruiting budget, and those are things that he really needs.
Well, two other things I wanted to ask you about. One, looking back on your time at Duke, on the field, off the field, whatever, what would you say that you're most proud of?
Well, I would say, what am I most proud of? I would say I had 3 pretty major surgeries at Duke, but I didn't miss a game. And I played through a lot of injuries, and I was actually all ACC. I was on the all ACC team all 4 years. I was honorable mention as a freshman. I was second team all ACC as a sophomore, and I was first team all ACC as a junior and a senior. And we weren't very good, unfortunately. And so back to how does that happen when you're on a team that's not successful? Well, I mean, I keep talking about my position coach. We spent hours dissecting the other team's offenses. I walked out there on Saturday afternoon with a very good understanding of how I was going to be blocked. When teams broke the huddle and they came up to the line of scrimmage, I knew pretty quickly, based on their formation and personnel, and then reading how the offensive linemen were standing or positioned, their splits, the amount of weight they had on their hand. I pretty well knew the kind of schemes and blocking strategies that were going to come in my direction just through hours and hours of film study. And so it was really gratifying for me to learn how to study the game of football, to learn how to prepare to be a champion, and to really earn success. So I am proud of those things because I worked very hard, and I had a lot of support. I didn't do it by myself by any means. I had a lot of support from my teammates and coaches, but I worked very hard, spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, and so it was gratifying to have some achievements, even though as a team we didn't get to the bowl games and have the type of winning seasons that we all that we were all striving for. So it's a team sport, make no mistake, and I played a position that was unselfish by nature, but we were all taking the field with the same goal to win for the team. So I wish I could say I was proud of our win-loss record, but the silver lining in there for me personally was that I had the opportunity to play a lot of football and play in the NFL, which is something that a lot of people don't have the opportunity to do.
Well, the win-loss record may not have been what we all wanted, but you had a great career. You played with a lot of really good guys who had great careers and have gone on to be great successes. And I have a lot of fond memories watching you guys with my dad at Columbo's Pizza back in good old Clemson, South Carolina. It was a lot of fun. And you have been very generous with your time. We've taken up a good while. here. So I want to give you a chance, instead of answering my questions, to take an open mic and talk about whatever you want.
Oh gosh, I feel like I've rambled a little bit here this evening. It's been fun, kind of just reflecting on things with you, Ben. And I don't have much more to add here. Thanks for the opportunity to reflect and just talk about Duke football, which is something I love. The university means a lot to me. The city of Durham does, and to connect with you living up there in my hometown of Roanoke, that's another place that's near and dear to my heart. So it's been great being part of your program.
Well, thank you for coming on. This was a lot of fun. It's funny how I connect with different eras of players of Duke football, guys through your era. I find primarily through LinkedIn, which I guess we're the only people who really use that site. Some other people, it's Twitter and other things. You just find them online. But I appreciate you coming on, and everybody who listens. I just want to thank you for all the support you guys have given to my dad. He has, I believe, finished up his chemo. I think he had his last one. He got some good news, and so they're going to be monitoring him going forward. And we hope the good news continues and that things go well for him. Chemo, as you guys can imagine, is pretty rough. It's been pretty rough for him, but he's done well. Mom's supporting him, and the family has been supporting him. So that's been good. And a lot of you guys help put those messages of support together for Dad. And I just wanted to say thank you for everybody who did that, and for all the good thoughts and good vibes you all have been sending our way. Now, we do have some other interviews kind of sort of planned. I've been slacking off a little bit. The new firm, I've been real busy, which is good. It's a good problem to have, to be busy. So we've been real busy of late. I gotta crack the whip a little bit, get a few more interviews put together, and keep this going. As we transition into the start of the football season, I'm going to do things a little bit different with the blog and the podcast. You will see that as it develops. But we're going to keep doing this as long as I still have time for it. So I enjoyed the chance to meet guys like Chris Combs, who was on here, and we got a chance to talk about how great Roanoke is. So people looking to move, you know where to move to.
That's right.
You can follow us on our website, boldcitycoordinators.com, where we're doing our Duke history season recaps for great seasons during the modern era of Duke football, which Coach Red Wilson years to the present. And you can follow us on Twitter at Duke FB Coverage. Send us a DM. Our DMs are open. And, of course, send us an email, boldcitycoordinators@gmail.com. And as always, go Duke.